Right, Jem, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jem Adams. I'm a curriculum leader for classics in Leeds, but I spent the first 8 years of my career teaching history and working as a curriculum leader for history before classics was introduced at my school. And one of the things that I was incredibly passionate about was having ancient history within our Key Stage 3 history curriculum, because one of the things that we are absolutely blessed with as history teachers is that there is just such a wealth of history. Like, where do you even start when you're trying to choose what history should be included, or really what's left out of your history curriculum? And quite often, it's the ancient world that people don't necessarily see the value in it, about how it can completely enrich your curriculum. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today, about why it should be included, but also how it can really benefit you for having such an enriching Key Stage 3 curriculum journey and make such a complex schema for students. So, firstly, students are going to get a huge amount of disciplinary knowledge. And this is what I'm going to focus a lot of speaking to you about today, about how we can introduce students to how historians use source evidence to construct the past, about how they can construct narratives, about how they actually use this evidence and evidential issues that they face. There are a lot of substantive knowledge that students can gain, but also we can introduce them to an absolute wealth of substantive concepts from the ancient world that, no matter what you are teaching within your Key Stage 3 history curriculum, these substantive concepts will continually come up again. We can create a great sense of period. One of the things that the ancient world is brilliant for is stories and narratives. And we can use them to help students make sense of such complex information and use them as real hooks in our curriculum. But the ancient world also provides you with some really important chronological markers, which students will then need moving forward into further parts of the history curriculum. So, starting with the disciplinary knowledge that students can gain. The source evidence from the ancient world is naturally incredibly complicated because we're dealing with a period of time that is such a long time ago. We've got a huge amount of evidence that is in ruins, that's fragmented, that has been passed down to us orally or has been lost altogether. And we've also got lots of literature that's beautiful to analyze. It's really important, and I think this is something that has been lost from a lot of Key Stage 3 history curriculums, is that great analysis of source evidence. And I think one of the things that has really hindered this is actually the history GCSE, with it constantly just asking questions about how useful a source is. I don't think students gain that incredibly robust knowledge that they need to actually analyze a source, to consider fully its utility. And this, it's so rare that students are ever presented with sources and asked to consider, well, how does a historian use this to create or construct the past, especially when there's such a severe lack of evidence from that period that remains. So, introducing an ancient world scheme of work, and that could be absolutely anything from whether you decide that you want to look at ancient Greece and you want to look at Athens and the foundation of democracy, whether you want an ancient Rome scheme of work, or whether you want to go further afield than that, whether you want to look at Persia or Egypt or Northern Africa. There's a whole host of places you can choose from, but they all offer us the same things when it comes to disciplinary knowledge because of these incredible problems that we have with the source evidence. Now, one of the schemes of work I'm going to be referring to is the ancient history scheme of work that I put into the history Key Stage 3 curriculum at my own school, which was a Roman scheme of work. And it was titled, Why Was Rex Such a Dirty Word in Ancient Rome? And I'll come back to that a bit later on. But one of the things that this scheme of work allowed us to do as well was embed an academic into our scheme of work and specifically look at how that academic used sources and the problems with those sources to construct her history. So we decided to go with Mary Beard and SPQR. And it wasn't for the fact that she is the most well-known classicist, or certainly one that we thought, oh, maybe students will recognize her. It was because of this absolutely beautiful piece of text that's in SPQR, which if you wanted to summarize to students why there are such problems with evidence and evidential issues and how historians construct the past, this absolutely summarizes it perfectly. So in this little section from SPQR, she talks about the fact that firstly, Roman history is constantly being rewritten, it's constantly changing and developing. So the idea that we can still learn more about areas of history, even though we might think, or students might think, that's 3,000 years ago, we know everything we could possibly know. She then goes on to talk about how it's such an incredible challenge. She references how Roman history can be different in the empire versus in Rome itself, and how Roman Britain doesn't look like Roman Africa. So again, she's bringing up the idea that even though we're looking at one place, depending on where the evidence has come from geographically, that's going to really change our viewpoints. She then addresses how, from different points of Roman history, that the levels of evidence that we have is completely different. So saying that from Rome's origins, that we have no contemporary written accounts. Then saying that we might get one piece of evidence and we've got to really scrutinize it. And then to the idea that there can be too much evidence. So from the 1st century BC, she talks about being swamped, that there is absolutely masses of evidence that complicates the narrative. This piece of writing from Mary Beard is so powerful because it allows us to represent the discipline of history really accurately in the classroom, rather than this very simplistic idea, well, is this source useful? What does it tell us and its utility? We can really delve into this historical argument for how these historians construct history using their source evidence, because building our disciplinary knowledge for students is part of the curriculum journey, about constantly introducing them to meaningful examples where history is extremely complicated. And the ancient world allows us to do that, to really add that complexity about, well, here are these different problems. And actually, students can grasp it quite easily because they understand that very simple fact of, oh, this is a really long time ago. So of course there's going to be problems with evidence. But then we can layer that level of complexity into it. One of the other brilliant things about the ancient world is that it is completely full of substantive concepts. One of the reasons that we chose at my school to go with ancient Rome and go with this unit where we look all the way back at the foundation of Rome, we track that through to the end of the monarchy, the start of the Republic, and then we go to the late Republic and we look at Caesar's assassination and the establishment of the Principate. The reason why we went with this was because the chronological markers, which I'll come back to, but the substantive concepts that it allowed us to introduce. There are not many units where you can move through monarchy, republic, empire, emperors. And these are substantive concepts where no matter what you are teaching, they're going to come up time and time again. Obviously, history is completely full of monarchies and that legitimization of power. We've then got whether you're going on to study the English Civil War, the French Revolution, you can then bring up the idea of republics and the idea of overthrowing monarchies, and of course, empires, whether you're doing the British Empire, the Roman Empire, or further afield. These are substantive concepts that just come up time and time again. In order for students to really grasp the idea of substantive concepts, they've got to have repeated encounters with them over time. We can't just have one unit where they suddenly get a republic introduced to them and then that's the one unit. If you've only got one scheme of work and that happens to be the French Revolution where they're learning what a republic is, that's just not enough for students to understand that complex idea of a republic. So again, when we looked at our Key Stage 3 history scheme of work, we've got all of our substantive concepts mapped so we can see that regardless of what unit we are studying, what's the focus that we have there. Now, the ancient world, again, no matter what part of it you choose, you will find that the ancient world is absolutely full of great substantive concepts that you can introduce students to. And again, whether that is looking at ancient Rome and whichever area of Rome you go with, or if you want to look at Athens and the foundation of democracy. So then you, in your further units, especially if you've got much later at GCSE or A level, if you've got units that are focusing on British democratic policy, you've already introduced them to the idea of what a democracy is. So in order to get that complex schema over time, we want repeated encounters with these substantive concepts. Let's say the ancient world is absolutely full of them. There's also, by including some of these units from the ancient world, there's a massive amount of tier 3, so our subject-specific vocabulary that we can introduce students to so incredibly early. So again, thinking about monarchies, republics, empire, principates, one of the biggest hindrances we know that students have on their ability to really succeed at school is their ability to understand complex vocabulary. It means that they cannot understand complex information if they don't have the vocabulary to do that. So within this unit, especially the one we created, we really thought about, well, what are those tier 3 words that we want students to know that are then going to be so beneficial as they move through their Key Stage 3 curriculum journey. And we just found that within ancient Rome, there was absolutely masses of them that allowed us to do that. And one of the most powerful ways that we can hook students into history is that use of powerful stories and narratives. Again, there's so much evidence that shows that using stories within our classroom helps students to understand complex information better. One of the things the ancient world is absolutely brilliant for is the stories that are within it. And this is something at primary school they're absolutely brilliant at doing, is hooking onto stories as a way of teaching students about the ancient world. So when students come into year 7, they've already got a love of the ancient world because it is part of the Key Stage 2 national curriculum to do ancient Greece. And they just naturally really love these stories. But the use of those stories is also a brilliant way to build up that disciplinary knowledge once again. Because how have these stories come to us? What is the source evidence? And crucially, again, that disciplinary knowledge of how has that historian constructed that narrative to create that story. Again, this is why we went with ancient Rome as our scheme of work, because what a brilliant story the assassination of Julius Caesar is. Again, thinking of using an academic within your work. Again, we have Mary Beard and we chose SPQR. Again, it was partly because of this beautiful bit of SPQR about the assassination of Julius Caesar. Because what Mary Beard does so wonderfully in that chapter is she says, this is a story, and she tells it, and she tells it like a story. So when she's talking about the only thing Caesar had to defend himself was a pen that he then swooshed at them. But she also says, this is how I've constructed my story. So she makes it clear there is no contemporary written account of Julius Caesar's assassination. So she's saying, this is the problem I face as a historian. I haven't got this evidence. But then she presents and says, these are the people who, after they wrote it. So she talks about these various other historical individuals. So although it's an incredible story that really hooks the students into lesson and allows them to make sense of what is a very complicated political plot, there's then an absolute mass of historical disciplinary knowledge about this is how I actually created this story. And again, regardless of which bit of the ancient world you choose, there will be a brilliant story. And then there will be source evidence there to say, well, how do we know this? How do we know that this is the actual story? And then you can bring in all of the differing evidence about what might have happened. Well, actually, we can complicate this even further by saying, well, we've got an alternative person who says that this might have happened. So it then brings up the question again for that disciplinary account. Well, who are we believing? Which source evidence? Which historian? Why has that particular historian chosen to go with that piece of evidence, but they've gone with that piece of evidence? So those stories, those narratives of the ancient world, because of that complexity, is brilliant for us to include. There obviously is this complexity in lots of other parts of history, but so much of history is a bit more clear cut. Where it's like, oh, we've got all of this evidence. We know that this is the particular story that happened. But when we come to the ancient world, all of those evidential issues allow us to build up that really clear disciplinary knowledge. And the ancient world is also full with masses of chronological markers. I'm sure as history teachers or classics teachers, you're fully used to being in your classroom and saying, oh, well, this happened at the same time that the Parthenon was constructed. And the students are like, when? When did that? The chronological markers that we get from the ancient world are going to be so useful to you regardless of what the rest of your Key Stage 3 history curriculum contains. So whether you're doing a real focus on British history and you're going to look at the Vikings or the Anglo-Saxons, if you chose to take a spin on introducing an ancient history module that looked at the Romans' invasion of Britain, or Boudicca's rebellion against the Romans, or the building of Hadrian's Wall, especially if that's geographically important to where your school is. These little markers allow students to then tag on and build on other knowledge. When we think about Rome's importance as well, introducing students very early on to the makeup of Europe and that geographical importance, especially as Rome, as it will remain such a seat of power, because I don't think there's any history curriculum that does not constantly reference the Pope's importance in medieval Europe and Rome as a seat of Christian power. But it also might be that you're going further afield. Are you looking at the Silk Roads? Are you looking at some of the Eastern history, or looking at the rise of places like Baghdad growing as a center of power and knowledge? If they've got that foundation of the ancient world, when it comes to introducing them to much later history, then they've already got some really strong chronological markers that they can tag and they can hang their history knowledge onto. So considering about that split in the empire, and then the rise of the East and the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople. And then, as I say, if you get later on and you're then looking at the Silk Roads and moving into the Reformation, these chronological markers really help students to hang their new historical knowledge onto. And again, thinking further afield about your history curriculum, especially if you've then got GCSE history, where medicine is such a huge unit. Regardless of where your history curriculum takes you, there is knowledge from the ancient world, source evidence from the ancient world, that will help students understand that knowledge better. So in my own school now, I do have a Key Stage 3 classics department, but I quite often work with my history department. Say, like, I've got a wealth of evidence from the ancient world. What are you doing later in history? So I know that they do medicine. So it's fabulous for me to be able to like drop in references to Galen or public health within my Key Stage 3 classics. But this is something you can just do within units that you choose to include in Key Stage 3 history. So thinking about why include the ancient world in your history curriculum, I say I'm in no doubt that monasteries, medieval Europe, the Reformation absolutely will come up in your Key Stage 3 curriculum journeys. Being able to explain to students about the monks and these ancient texts that they are creating manuscripts of in their scriptoriums, about the impact that the Reformation then has on knowledge, is something that they can then very clearly link back to the classical world. If they are learning about the Reformation, not the Reformation, sorry, the Renaissance, and we're then going back to the Enlightenment and how all of this knowledge from the ancient world begins to resurface. And where has most of that knowledge come from? Well, it's been snuck out of Constantinople before the fall of the Byzantine Empire. They've already had that ancient history unit introducing them to the expanse of the Roman Empire or the growth of knowledge in the East. They've already got such a strong chronological marker to hang that onto. The absolute masses of classical architecture that begins to appear all around Europe and the world throughout the 17th to 20th centuries. So you can show them, they've seen pictures of the classical world within ancient history units. That helps them to understand, well, there's this resurgence and the importance that the printing press will then play in absolutely changing Europe completely through the spread of those ancient texts. So when considering what part of the ancient world that you would want to include within your history Key Stage 3 curriculums, look at what you're teaching later in your Key Stage 3 curriculum journey. What are those historical units that you have chosen to include? And that will then help you decide, well, which bits of ancient history do I want to include as my focus? That will then help students to understand those much later bits of history, because there are so many ways that ancient history can help you. And I know that certainly now my head of history understands just how important ancient history is. She comes to me a lot and she's like, could you cover this, or could you just in a lesson show them a picture of this? So just the other day we were talking about how during the Edwardian and Victorian periods, when they're out and they're all these rich, wealthy Victorians are going to excavate places in the ancient world, and they get enthralled by the discovery of sites like Mycenae, and then much later the discoveries of the Egyptian tombs. It then helped her to really explain to her students why the Victorians were going on promenades through beautiful gardens, especially places like Fountains Abbey, where they've then got a statue of Poseidon, and they've got an exact replica of the Temple of Piety from Rome. So the fact that we'd already introduced students to, well, this is what a temple looks like and this is who Poseidon is, really then fed so nicely into their history schemes of work. So there's so many ways through building substantive knowledge, but I would say I think the building of disciplinary knowledge, that really complex understanding of how historians use source evidence, is absolutely the way that ancient history can benefit your history curriculums. If you do want to look at or get a scheme of work completely for free on Classics for All's website in their resources hub, you can get the scheme of work that I wrote for our school completely for free. It's fully resourced with schemes of learning, what core knowledge is, hinterland knowledge is for that unit, the disciplinary knowledge. All 10 lessons are in there as well, including knowledge retrieval assessments. And so that's just a little takeaway for you for free if you do want a fully made ancient history scheme of work for you. So we've got a couple of minutes. Happy to answer any questions that you have for me, or if you want to contact me at a later date about assisting with building ancient history into your Key Stage 3 history curriculums, I'm more than happy to do that. Thank you.
Hiya. Just I think I've not quite followed a bit to do with the context of your school. So is this you teaching ancient history in a Key Stage 3 classics timetable slot, or is this you teaching ancient history in a Key Stage 3 history timetable slot?
Sorry, it's both.
Right.
I now have a Key Stage 3 classics timetable, but we've only introduced that in the last year. So this particular unit that I've referred to, the Why Was Rex Such a Dirty Word, that was taught by our history team.
So it's designed to go in the history
Yes.
timetable slot. Okay,
Yes,
grand.
absolutely. So this particular scheme of work is written to be a history scheme of work, not a classics scheme of work. Although it does have classical elements in it, when it was written, it was specifically designed to go into the history timetable in order to introduce them to, rather than classical disciplinary knowledge, to introduce them to historical disciplinary knowledge and historical substantive concepts.
And just related question, how much time a week did they have within
It
that?
was 2 hours a week.
Right.
So this was a 10 lesson scheme. So we used to do it at the start of year 7 as our very first unit. So for our first half term, and we found that that worked incredibly well because of just the absolute wealth of substantive concepts that it had, and it allowed us a really nice springboard into our next unit, which was on the Anglo-Saxons and looking at how Britain developed as a result after the Romans left.
So Thanks, Jen. There's a quick question from Christopher in the chat. Can you see that?
Oh, I'm not sure I can. Oh, hold on.
I've just everything's disappearing on this today. Chat, let's have a look. Any thoughts about linking with other subjects as well as history, e.g., English and Shakespeare's Julius Caesar?
Yeah, absolutely. So our English department have just introduced the Odyssey to their Key Stage 3 English curriculum. And I've worked with a couple of other schools who, within English, they've definitely built some ancient texts. And again, that's an absolutely brilliant way. It helps the history department as well as classical literature, massively helps the English department as well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And I've just answered a question about Key Stage 3. I think in the interest of time, we're going to have to say thank you very much, Jem.
No
If
problem.
anybody
Thank
wants to
you.
stay on for the next Key Stage 3 session, please do. But if you're zipping off to another one, you've got in all the log-on details. I'm going to stop this recording and then start again. But thanks, Jem. That was really interesting.
No problem.